At some point, the mind may begin to notice that the sense of being someone, a distinct person moving through life with a past, a personality, a history, is not simply something that exists on its own. It is something that is continuously being told, not necessarily out loud, but internally through acquired, an ongoing narration that rarely stops. Throughout the day, small interpretations appear about what is happening and what it means in relation to you. Something pleasant occurs and immediately a thought says, "This is good for me." Something uncomfortable happens and another thought says, "This should not be happening to me." Through these constant interpretations, experience becomes organized around a center that seems to exist at the heart of everything. The center is what most people refer to as me. Yet when attention begins to look closely, the presence of this me is rarely found directly. What appears instead are thoughts describing it, memories referring to it, judgments defending it, plans attempting to secure its future. The sense of self seems to be woven from these elements, like a story slowly being written in real time. Each memory becomes a chapter about what has already happened. Each expectation becomes a projection about what might still occur. Together they create the impression that there is a continuous character living through all of it. But what is interesting is how this character is maintained. The story of me is not written once and then stored permanently somewhere in the mind. It is being recreated constantly. Every time a memory is recalled, the mind reaffirms who you believe you have been. Every time a plan forms about the future, it reinforces who you imagine you will become. Even in quiet moments, small thoughts appear that subtly reinforce the narrative. What you like, what you dislike, what you fear, what you hope for, what you believe about yourself. In this way, the sense of identity remains active. The story keeps moving. And because this movement is so continuous, it begins to feel natural, almost unquestionable. It feels obvious that the character described by these thoughts must exist exactly as the story presents it. After all, the memories feel real. The emotions feel personal. The preferences seem to belong to someone specific. Yet the more carefully the mind observes this process, the more it begins to see that the sense of me is closely tied to the act of remembering and interpreting experience. Without reference to memory, the identity that feels so familiar becomes difficult to locate. In the immediate moment, before thought labels what is happening, there may simply be perception itself. Sounds being heard, sensations being felt, light entering the eyes, the rhythm of breathing. None of these experiences announce a personal identity. They simply occur. Only when thought begins describing them does the story reappear. Thought says, "This is happening to me." Thought says, "This reminds me of something that happened before." Thought says, "This might affect my future." In each case, the event itself is quickly placed into a narrative structure that connects it to a central character. That character is me. And slowly it becomes possible to see that what has always felt like a solid identity may actually be a living narrative. One that the mind continues to tell moment after moment, without realizing it is the storyteller. When this possibility begins to appear, a very subtle question may arise. If the sense of self is maintained through the ongoing story the mind tells about itself, what remains when the storytelling pauses. The story of me is built primarily from memory. What you believe yourself to be is largely shaped by what the mind recalls about what has happened before. Memories of childhood, of conversations, of successes, of failures, of moments that seemed important at the time. All of these become pieces of a narrative that gradually forms the idea of a personal identity. When the mind remembers something, it rarely appears as a neutral image. The memory often carries interpretation with it. A simple event becomes labeled as something that shaped who you are. A moment of embarrassment becomes proof that you are a certain type of person. A moment of praise becomes evidence of ability. Slowly, the mind gathers these fragments and arranges them into a coherent storyline. Over time, the storyline begins to feel stable. You remember certain events again and again, and with each recollection, the sense of identity strengthens. It begins to feel as though there is a consistent character that has moved through all of these experiences. The memories seem to confirm that the same you has always been there, witnessing each moment as life unfolded. But when memory is observed more carefully, something interesting becomes visible. A memory is not the past itself, it is an image of the past appearing in the present. The event is gone. The situation no longer exists, what remains is a mental reconstruction of it. Yet when the memory appears, the mind often treats it as if the past itself has returned. The image feels vivid, the emotion may reappear, and immediately the mind says, "That happened to me." In that moment, the memory strengthens the story. The mind connects the present moment with something that occurred before and places both events within the same narrative timeline. The identity seems to stretch backward through memory and forward through expectation. Through this stretching, the sense of a continuous self begins to take shape. But the continuity depends on constant reference. Without recalling the past, the sense of a stable identity becomes less clear. In the immediate moment before memory is consulted, experience may simply appear as sensation and perception, sound, light, movement, breath, thought itself arising and passing. None of these experiences necessarily confirm the presence of a personal story. It is memory that reconnects everything. Memory says this has happened before. Memory says this reminds me of something I experienced years ago. Memory says this situation fits into the pattern of who I believe myself to be. In this way, the narrative of identity is reinforced again and again through recognition. Recognition gives the story its feeling of reality. But recognition is happening now. Each time the mind remembers, it is rebuilding the past within the present moment. The memory is not a permanent record stored somewhere unchanged. It is an active reconstruction shaped by interpretation, emotion, and expectation. Each time it appears, it subtly updates the story of who you believe yourself to be. And because this reconstruction happens so quickly, the mind rarely notices the process itself. It simply experiences the finished story. The character called me appears to have always existed, moving through time with a stable identity. Yet what attention begins to see is that the stability of this identity depends on the constant retelling of the narrative. The past becomes the foundation of the story, and the story becomes the sense of self. If memory provides the structure of the story of me, emotion provides its intensity. Without emotional energy, many memories would appear as simple neutral images. they would pass through the mind without leaving a strong impression. But when a memory carries emotional weight, it becomes far more influential in shaping identity. Moments of strong emotion tend to be remembered more vividly than ordinary experiences. A moment of rejection may remain in memory for years. A moment of praise may become part of how you define your abilities. A painful event may quietly shape the way the mind interprets situations long after the event itself has passed. Because emotion gives memory a sense of importance, certain memories begin to stand out more than others. The mind returns to them repeatedly. Each time they are remembered, the emotional tone may appear again, reinforcing the belief that these events say something meaningful about who you are. Through this repetition, emotional memories begin to organize the narrative of identity. The mind does not simply remember events. It interprets them. It connects them. It creates conclusions. A painful moment becomes proof that you are someone who struggles. A successful moment becomes proof that you are someone capable. A moment of conflict becomes evidence about how relationships work in your life. Gradually, the emotional memory becomes more than a recollection. It becomes part of the definition of the self. But when attention observes this process closely, an interesting detail becomes visible. The emotion that seems to belong to the past is actually being felt in the present. The event itself is gone, yet the body may react as if it is happening again. A memory appears, and the emotional response follows almost instantly. The mind then says, "This feeling is part of who I am." In this way, emotion strengthens the narrative of identity. The story feels personal because it is not only remembered. It is felt. Each emotional reaction seems to confirm the reality of the story that thought is telling. Yet, the emotion itself is also a present experience. As the narrative of identity forms through memory and emotion, another process quietly begins to shape it even further. The mind starts to place itself in relation to other people, almost without noticing it. Comparison becomes a central mechanism through which the story of me develops. From early childhood, the mind learns to evaluate itself by looking outward. Someone else appears more successful, more confident, more intelligent, more accepted. Another person appears less capable, less fortunate, less admired. Through these constant comparisons, the mind gradually constructs a position for itself within the social world. This position becomes part of identity. You are not only someone with a past and emotional memories. You are also someone who exists relative to others. Someone who is ahead or behind. Someone who is respected or overlooked. Someone who belongs somewhere within the imagined hierarchy of human experience. The mind rarely notices how deeply this comparison shapes the sense of self. A simple situation occurs, someone receives praise. Another person is criticized instantly. The mind begins measuring. Where do I stand in relation to this? Am I doing better or worse? Am I closer to success or further from it? These evaluations may happen so quickly that they feel automatic. But each comparison subtly strengthens the narrative of identity. If the mind repeatedly concludes that others are ahead, the story may become one of inadequacy. If the mind concludes that it is superior in certain ways, the story may become one of confidence or pride.
In both cases, the identity is being constructed through interpretation rather than direct observation. What is interesting is that the comparison itself depends on ideas rather than reality. The mind compares images: an image of yourself, an image of another person. These images are assembled from limited information, memories, assumptions, and projections. Yet the emotional response to the comparison can feel very real. A moment of jealousy may appear when another person succeeds. A moment of satisfaction may appear when you believe you have achieved something others have not. These emotional reactions reinforce the narrative that the self must constantly define its position within the world. But when attention begins to observe comparison directly, something unexpected becomes visible. The comparison does not simply evaluate identity. It sustains it. Without comparison, the sense of a defined self becomes less solid. If the mind is not constantly measuring itself against others, the narrative that describes who you are begins to lose some of its structure. The identity that once felt so clearly defined starts to look more like a set of interpretations that are continually being updated. In this way, comparison becomes one of the engines of a story of me. Each new situation becomes another opportunity for the mind to refine the narrative, another piece of evidence about where you belong in the imagined landscape of success, failure, acceptance, and rejection. Yet the entire process depends on thought, interpreted in experience. Without the constant activity of comparison, experience might appear very differently. What is happening would simply be happening. The actions of others would not immediately become measurements of your own value. The movement of a life would not automatically translate into conclusions about who you are. Seeing this does not instantly stop comparison, but it reveals something important. The story of me is not fixed. It is being written continuously.
As comparison strengthens the narrative of identity, another movement naturally begins to appear alongside it. The mind does not only construct the story of me, it also begins to protect it. Once an image of yourself has formed, the mind becomes sensitive to anything that might challenge or contradict that image. A comment from another person, a moment of failure, a misunderstanding, or even a small criticism can suddenly feel far more significant than the situation itself might seem to justify. This reaction does not arise randomly. It arises because the mind interprets the event as something that threatens the narrative it has built about who you are. If the story says you are intelligent, criticism may feel like an attack. If the story says you are kind, being misunderstood may feel deeply uncomfortable. If the story says you are capable and successful, failure may feel almost intolerable. The intensity of the reaction often reveals how strongly the mind has become attached to the image it has created. What becomes interesting when this process is observed carefully is how quickly the mind moves to defend the identity it has constructed. Sometimes this defense appears as argument. The mind begins explaining why the criticism is wrong or unfair. Sometimes it appears as justification, quietly rewriting the event in a way that protects the existing self-image. In other moments, the defense may appear as withdrawal. Instead of confronting the challenge, the mind may simply move away from the situation entirely. It may avoid people, avoid conversations, or avoid environments where the image of self might be questioned. All of these responses share a common structure. They attempt to preserve the narrative of me. Yet when attention begins to observe this movement directly, something subtle becomes visible. The emotional reaction does not come from the event itself. It comes from the interpretation that the event threatens the story the mind has created. Without that narrative, the situation would appear very differently. A criticism would simply be a statement someone made a mistake, would simply be an action that did not work as intended. A disagreement would simply be two perspectives meeting in the same moment. But when the narrative of identity is active, each of these events becomes something personal. The mind immediately interprets them as something happening to me. This personalization is what creates the sense of psychological conflict. The mind is no longer just responding to the situation itself, it is responding to what the situation implies about the identity it is trying to maintain. And because identity is built from memory and interpretation rather than something solid or fixed, it constantly requires protection. The narrative must be reinforced again and again in order to remain convincing. This creates a subtle tension within the mind. Life continues moving, presenting situations that cannot be fully controlled or predicted. But the narrative of identity wants stability, it wants consistency, it wants confirmation that the image of self remains valid. When those two movements meet, conflict naturally appears. But as attention observes this process more closely, an interesting possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps the conflict does not come from life itself. Perhaps it comes from the effort to preserve a story about who you are, while life continues to unfold in unpredictable ways. Seeing this does not immediately dissolve the narrative of identity, but it begins to expose how much effort the mind invests in protecting it. As the mind continues protecting the image it has created, another movement quietly becomes visible within the structure of identity. The story of me is rarely limited to what has already happened. It also extends forward into what might still become possible. The mind does not only remember the past, it also imagines the future. Within these imagined futures, the narrative of identity finds new forms of continuation. The mind begins constructing images of what you could become, a more successful version of yourself, a wiser version, a more fulfilled version, someone who has finally resolved the uncertainties that currently remain. These projections feel meaningful because they appear to give direction to life. Instead of simply experiencing what is happening now, the mind becomes oriented toward a future state where something important will finally be achieved. The story of identity stretches forward, creating a path from who you are to who you hope to become. In this way, becoming becomes part of the narrative. The mind may say, "I am not there yet, but I am moving toward it." This movement appears positive, even necessary. It seems to provide motivation, purpose, and structure to daily life. But when attention begins to observe this movement carefully, another layer of the story becomes visible. The future identity is still part of the same narrative. The person you hope to become is imagined using the same memories, values, fears, and desires that shape the identity you currently believe yourself to be. The mind rearranges these elements and projects them forward in time, creating a vision of improvement or completion. Yet the image remains a construction of thought. The mind then begins organizing its actions around reaching this imagined version of itself. Effort becomes directed towards closing the gap between what you are now and what you believe you should become. And within this gap, a subtle tension begins to live. because the present moment is constantly being evaluated according to whether it moves you closer to the future image. Success feels like confirmation that you are progressing toward the identity you seek. Failure feels like evidence that the desired version of yourself remains distant. This evaluation creates a constant sense of movement. Life becomes a process of becoming. But what is rarely questioned is the assumption that something essential will finally be completed when that future identity is reached. The mind believes that somewhere ahead there exists a version of me that will finally feel whole, stable, and resolved. And because this belief feels so convincing, the search continues. New goals appear, new improvements are imagined, new ideals of what the self could become take shape. The narrative of identity grows not only through memory, but also through anticipation. Yet something curious may begin to reveal itself when attention watches this process closely. Each time a goal is reached, the mind does not stop becoming. Another image appears. Another improvement becomes necessary. Another version of yourself waits somewhere in the future. This suggests that the movement of becoming may not actually lead to completion at all. It may simply be another way the story of me continues. The narrative does not end because it always creates another chapter waiting ahead. And when this becomes visible, the question that begins to appear is no longer about how to improve the story. It is about whether the story itself has ever been what you truly are. As attention remains with this question, another detail of the narrative structure begins to appear. The story of me does not only continue through memory and future projection, it also continues through constant reinforcement in the present moment. Throughout the day, small thoughts quietly repeat the identity the mind believes it is. A situation occurs and immediately a thought appears that interprets it in relation to the self. Something pleasant happens and the mind says, "I like this." Something uncomfortable appears and the mind responds, "I don't want this." A conversation takes place and the mind evaluates how it reflects on the image it holds about itself. These small interpretations happen so quickly that they usually pass unnoticed. Yet each one subtly strengthens the narrative. Every reaction adds another sentence to the ongoing story. Every judgment confirms the idea that there is a central character experiencing the world. Over time, these constant reinforcements make the identity feel stable and continuous. It begins to feel as though the self has always been there, quietly observing life from the same center. But when attention watches the process closely, something unusual becomes visible. The center is not found before the interpretation. It appears within the interpretation. A moment occurs, a sound, a sensation, an interaction. Then almost instantly a thought interprets it in relation to a personal identity. That interpretation gives the impression that there is someone at the center of the experience. But the sense of someone emerges inside the interpretation itself. Without that interpretation, the moment would still exist exactly as it is. A sound would simply be heard, a sensation would simply appear. A conversation would unfold naturally. The personal reference would not necessarily be present. This suggests that the identity is continuously produced through interpretation, rather than existing independently of it. The mind tells a story about what is happening, and within that story, the character called me appears again. This does not mean the mind is doing something wrong. Interpretation is part of how thought organizes experience. It helps navigate the world, communicate with others, and remember what has happened. But the story becomes powerful when it is no longer recognized as a story. When the narrative is mistaken for reality itself, the character inside it begins to feel absolutely real. The mind forgets that it is participating in the creation of the story every moment. Instead, it feels as though the story is simply describing something that already exists. But observation reveals something subtler. The narrative is not only describing the self, it is continuously producing it. And the moment this becomes visible, the sense of identity begins to look less solid than it once appeared.
When the narrative structure of identity begins to slow down, the change may at first feel subtle. Nothing dramatic announces that something has shifted. Thoughts still appear, reactions still happen, and life continues unfolding exactly as before. Yet the constant reinforcement of the story begins to weaken slightly. Moments appear in which the mind does not immediately interpret what is happening in relation to a personal center. A sound is heard without the thought that it is happening to someone. A sensation is felt without immediately becoming part of a personal description. An interaction unfolds without the mind instantly evaluating what it means for the identity it believes it carries. These moments may be brief, almost unnoticeable. But they introduce something new into experience. For a short instant, the story is not actively being told. During that pause, there is still perception. There is still awareness of what is happening. The environment is still visible, sounds are still present, the body is still breathing. But the narrative layer that normally organizes everything around the idea of me is temporarily absent. In those moments, nothing is missing. Experience continues without the need for a central character. This can feel surprising because the mind has long assumed that identity is necessary for experience to occur. It has believed that someone must be present in order for life to be known. Yet when the narrative briefly falls silent, awareness does not disappear. Perception remains fully alive. In fact, something about perception may even feel clearer when the narrative is quiet. Without the constant interpretation of events in relation to a personal identity, attention may become more open to what is actually present. Sounds are simply sounds. Sensations are simply sensations. Movements in the world unfold without immediately becoming part of a personal story. This does not erase the ability to think or remember. Thought can still appear whenever it is needed. Practical thinking still functions, language still works, and daily responsibilities remain possible. But the difference lies in the fact that the narrative no longer dominates every moment. The story of me becomes something that occasionally appears rather than something that must constantly be maintained. And when this happens, a quiet question begins to emerge within the mind. If experience can continue without the story being told in every moment, then perhaps the story was never the foundation of awareness in the first place. Perhaps the narrative has been something added to experience rather than something required for it. This realization does not destroy the story, but it changes how seriously the mind takes it. The character called me may still appear in thought, yet it begins to look more like a role in a story than the unquestionable center of existence. And from this perspective, the narrative begins to lose some of the weight. once carried.
As the narrative of identity begins to lose some of its constant momentum, another reaction may quietly appear within the mind. The slowing of the story does not always feel comfortable at first. For a long time, the sense of me has functioned as the center around which experience was organized. The mind has relied on that center to interpret events, make decisions, and understand its place in the world. When that center becomes less certain, a subtle uneasiness may begin to surface. The mind may start asking quiet questions that feel difficult to answer. If the story of who I am is not always present, then what exactly remains? If the identity I believed myself to be is something constructed by thought, then where is the one who has been living this life? These questions can initially create a sense of instability. The narrative of identity has provided continuity. It connected the past to the present and extended itself into the future. It gave life a structure in which experience appeared to belong to a central character, moving through time. Without that structure, the mind may briefly feel as though something familiar is dissolving. This reaction is natural. The mind has spent years reinforcing the identity through memory, interpretation, and anticipation. It has learned to rely on the narrative as a kind of psychological orientation. When that orientation weakens, the mind may attempt to quickly rebuild it. Thought may begin searching for new explanations. It may attempt to redefine the self in more subtle ways. Instead of saying, I am this person, it may say, I am the one who is observing. Instead of abandoning identity entirely, the narrative simply changes form. In this way, the story of me tries to preserve itself. But careful observation begins to reveal something important about this reaction. The uneasiness that appears is itself another movement of thought. A thought arises that suggests something essential might be disappearing. Another thought reacts to that suggestion with concern. Together they create the impression that something real is being threatened. Yet what is actually disappearing is not awareness itself. What begins to dissolve is the certainty of the narrative. Awareness remains present throughout the entire process. Thoughts appear within it. Reactions appear within it. Even the feeling of uncertainty is simply another experience unfolding inside awareness. Nothing fundamental has been lost. What has changed is the assumption that the story must always be there. As this becomes clearer, the sense of uneasiness begins to soften. The mind gradually recognizes that awareness does not depend on the narrative in order to exist. Experience continues to unfold naturally, whether the story is being actively told or not. The character called me may still appear in thought from time to time, but it no longer needs to be constantly protected.
can simply appear as another movement within awareness. And when the mind begins to see this clearly, something very quiet, yet very significant begins to happen. The story of me stops feeling like the center of life. It begins to look more like one of many patterns, moving within awareness itself.
When the story of identity is finally seen with complete clarity, something unexpectedly simple begins to reveal itself. For most of life, the mind believed that the narrative of me was the center of experience. Every memory seemed to belong to that center. Every reaction appeared to confirm it. Every plan for the future extended the life of the character that thought had created. But as observation deepens, the structure of this story becomes fully visible. Thought remembers something and calls it my past. Thought anticipates something and calls it my future. Thought reacts to what is happening and calls it my experience. Through this constant repetition, the mind builds a continuous thread that appears to run through the entire movement of life. Yet that thread is made of thought. It exists only when the narrative is being told. The moment attention stops reinforcing the story, even briefly, something very clear can be noticed. Experience continues exactly as before. The world is still present. Sounds are heard. The body moves, breathing continues, awareness remains fully alive. But the character called me is not required for any of this to happen. Life unfolds on its own. A narrative may still appear occasionally, just as any other thought appears. A memory might arise describing the past. A thought might imagine what could happen tomorrow. These movements are natural functions of the mind. Yet they no longer define the center of existence. They are simply reflections appearing within awareness. This realization does not remove the practical identity needed for daily life. A name can still be used, a history can still be remembered. Relationships still continue, communication still happens naturally. But the psychological weight carried by the identity begins to dissolve. The story of me is no longer mistaken for the foundation of awareness. It is simply one of the many patterns thought creates in order to navigate the world. And when this becomes fully visible, something deeply quiet begins to settle in the mind. The search for a permanent identity gradually comes to an end, not because the mind has discovered a better definition of the self, but because it has seen that the self it was searching for has always been a story. Awareness itself never needed that story in order to exist. It was present before the narrative began. It remains present while the narrative appears. And it continues unchanged even when the narrative becomes silent. What remains is not a new identity. It is simply the open presence in which every experience, every thought, and every story quietly appears and disappears.